Hi everyone, welcome to this book discussion on biographies as a methodological tool, and we are going to talk about this particular aspect of methodology through a very recent and exciting book, Iru, The Remarkable Life of Irawati Karve by Urmilla Deshpande and Thiago Pinto Barbosa. We've already published a review of this book, and you must be familiar with the works of Irawati Karve, as she is one of the most well-known anthropologist of her times. So today we have both the authors as well as Professor Rukmini Sen with us, who has very kindly agreed to be moderating this session. So I'm going to very quickly now introduce our speakers. Urmilla Deshpande writes novels and short fiction. Her published works include A Pack of Lies, Slither, Carnal Prose, and Body and Blood, stories on breaking the Ten Commandments. Thiago Pinto Barbosa is a Brazilian anthropologist based in Leipzig and Berlin, a member of the research group Anthropology of Global Inequalities at the University of Beirut and a lecturer at Leipzig University. Thiago's doctoral dissertation, published as Racializing Caste, Anthropology Between Germany and India and the Legacy of Irawati Karve, 1905 to 1970, has received multiple awards. Rukmini Sen is a professor of sociology at the School of Liberal Arts, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She served as a joint secretary of the Indian Association of Women's Studies and as part of the panel experts of the National Commission for Women since 2011. Her teaching and research interests are in the fields of sociology of law, sociology of kinship and intimacy, feminist pedagogy and jurisprudence, qualitative research methods, and disability studies. Her works have been published in Economic and Political Weekly, Journal of Indian Law and Society, Journal of Educational Planning and Administration, Indian Anthropologist, Indian Journal of Gender Studies, and Contemporary Voice of Dalit, among many others. She has also co-edited volumes published by Orient Black Swan and Zuban. We had earlier done an interview with Professor Sen when doing sociology was just a year old. So welcome back, Professor Sen, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rituparna. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to doing sociology, Rituparna and Dipali, for having me here to moderate this book. I would start with my own autobiographical notes with Irawati Karve, if I may. I encountered the Mahabharata rewriter, Irawati, before being exposed to the anthropologist Irawati. Despite my training in sociology, in BA and MA in Calcutta and Delhi, speaks volumes about ways in which curriculum is probably developed. Yugant, the end of an epoch, I believe, remains one of my earliest immersion to feminism, redefining Draupadi as Nathavati Anathavat, having husbands but living like a widow. The book that we are discussing today in a chapter, Grihasti Parva, refers to Yugant and Karve's enduring relation with her husband, Dinkar. I quote from the book, "A champion, partner, lover, admirer, friend, and a companion in every way," unquote. My next encounter with Karve was when I taught her classic kinship organization in India in my undergraduate marriage, family, and kinship forms course at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. A book that Karve dedicates to my husband, a book which would never have been either thought out or written but for you. A book published in 1953, whose research started in 1938-39 in Maharashtra, and then moving across the length and breadth of the country, taking measurements, blood samples, and collecting information about kinship practices and terminologies. To imagine a woman anthropologist traveling in different modes of public transport with mostly men around at the dawn of India's independence is inspiring, to say the least. An encounter that has not yet happened for me, is her 1966 essay, The Indian Woman in 1975. I chanced upon it through this book, Iru. According to the authors of this book, this particular essay is, and I quote, a pioneering sociological diagnosis and trend assessment on the employment and education of women in India. Unquote. What is important to note for some of us doing feminist sociology in India, this essay predates the Towards Equality report of 1974, which is considered as a comprehensive survey-based document on the status of women in India. And Karve has written something on the status of women in India before the Towards Equality report. My third moment with Karve was through Nandini Sundar's extensive essay, In the Cause of Anthropology, the Life and Work of Irawati Karve, as part of the book Anthropologist in the East. Sundar writes, and I quote, her literary writings in Marathi were examples of a delicate balance between involved and detached participant observation. Her daily immersion in the social life of Maharashtra was transformed with a sociologist's and writer's eye into flashes of rare insight and vivid portraits of culture, unquote. Karve was responsible for what is known as reviving the genre of personal essays. And that brings me to my latest encounter with Karve, her personal essay, On the Road, a Maharashtrian Pilgrimage. Where does the personal, cultural, historical, sociological selves converse? Irawati was responsible for reviving the genre of personal essays, and that brings me to my last encounter with Karve, On the Road, a Maharashtrian Pilgrimage. Where does the personal, the cultural, historical, sociological selves converse? Iru, the remarkable life of Irawati Karve, is a gift to that convergence, to that conversation. What does writing about lives mean? Remembering, documenting, chronicling, but not necessarily in a chronological manner, mapping fields, actors, times, journeys, storytelling. At a time when I have started working on life writings of feminist sociologists and anthropologists in India, it is exciting to note that there is a full-fledged life writing, a biography. What is it that the authors would want to call this work? Besides her own personal reflexive essays, enabling us to archive knowledge. And that is the importance of biography as a methodological tool in sociological knowledge. I would now like to invite Urmilla Deshpande, one of the authors in this book, to talk about whether you were looking at this book as a project in family history, or whether you were digging into one's illustrious grandmother, but basically to talk about the process of writing this book. Over to you, Urmilla.
Hi, and thank you for having us on this very interesting forum. That's actually what I did want to talk about was my process, because as I was saying earlier, I'm not an academic, I'm a fiction writer, and I just wanted to talk about how we came to do this project and how it progressed. So we had never done this before, and there was no template for how we would go about writing this book. So first of all, it didn't even start out as a biography. I have a partner who for many years has said to me, you should do something about your family, you should do something about your history. And I just dismissed it because this was never interesting to me. And so he lives in Germany, so we're often in Germany and usually in Cologne, but I was in Berlin visiting a friend. And when I was walking around there, I began to think about the fact that my grandmother had been there during that time. And I thought I would write a novel because Berlin at that time was so exciting and interesting. I thought I wanted to do a novel based on just her being there during that time, just an Indian woman who was in Berlin doing a PhD and just that as a starting point. And I never had as such Irawati Karve in mind. It was just to be based on that. And at the same time, at that time, so I spoke with my publisher about this, and she was, but she misunderstood. And then about a few months later, she said to me, "Are you done with that biography?" And I said, "I'm not doing a biography. I'm doing a novel." And she said, "Oh, because we need a novel on, the Speaking Tiger was doing a series on, important and interesting Indian people." And so I thought about this, and I thought, I don't want to do a biography because that's a big onerous project. I don't want to take this on. It's very heavy for me. It's a family. And then I thought I don't want someone else to do it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. At the same time, I had contacted Nandini Sundar because, like you, I'd read her quite wonderful and quite comprehensive um, sort of short biography of her academic work and everything. And I said, can you help me if I need some help? And she said, yes. And then she put me in, she said, you and Tiago should talk to each other. And so at the same time, all this came together. I applied for a grant. I got a grant from the Robert Bosch Foundation to do research for the novel. And so all this came together, and I thought I have to ask Tiago if he'll do this with me. And fortunately for me, and probably him, he said yes. And so that's how, we got together, started uh, doing this. Now, so it was kind of an accidental and unintentional way that we do this biography. Now, as for the writing, I think I'd already been reading Tiago's dissertation as it progressed, and I feel like the way I think we mesh together perfectly because I trust the way he looks at things. He has a very his academic thinking, the way he's very, 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 very serious about and very thorough about his examination of everything that he looks at. And I mean everything. I mean, he has his funny sides, but he's very serious about it. And I was actually the one who would go off on various branches, and he had to sort of drag me back from. For example, it's funny that you would talk about her relationship with her husband, because that was one of the things that, I would go off on. He was someone that I knew growing up. And my grandmother, Iru, died when I was 7 years old. So I didn't know her, but I knew Dinu. So I would keep going off into how wonderful he was, how wonderful. And Tiago would be like, look, we're writing, we're not doing this again where we, give a man credit for a woman's work. This biography is on Irawati. So that was one of the things, funnily enough, so one of the things in the process was I read as much as I could of Irawati's own work, which was extensive, all her English work, everything that I could find, everything that Tiago had written. I listened to all his interviews, that he had done amazing interviews with, for his dissertation, with family members, with people, some of her students, and not colleagues, but some of her students who were still alive. So I listened to all that work. I read as much as I could about the history of Germany, because that period was particularly interesting to me. So I read a lot about the history. And my partner, again, who was German, is very interested in, or is very knowledgeable about art and photography and films of that time. And so I was like, I had access to those things which I wouldn't have access to. So I just immersed myself in all these things. And Tiago and I also spent some time together in Berlin, and we walked around there. We went to the places she lived, the uh, the place where she worked, where he'll talk about, I suppose, where he himself works. And then I started getting into reading her Marathi essays. And for me, those are very personal essays. And in this, she has spoken about every aspect of her life. Now, Marathi is not my first language. English is my first language. So it was a little bit difficult for me to get into, but it was something I realized I had to do, because that's a very different kind of work that she's done, where she, like you said, it comes together where she's got that scholarly eye, where she's an academic, but then she'll connect it with her personal life and her feelings about how she looks at the world. And that was fascinating to me. So, for example, there's this one wonderful essay called Women and Culture, where she talks about the practice, I hate saying the practice of wife beating, but she talks about that. So she was on a field trip, and she was just in conversation with her host, and they encountered something that happened which got them talking about this. And she said to him, this was their field trip was not related to this at all, but she said to him, when we go on this field trip, I want you to ask every single man you meet whether he beats his wife. And then when we're done with this, we'll get back to it. And this man, at the end of it, was completely downhearted and disheartened, because he was like, how is this country going to progress? Not a single man I asked said, no, I don't beat my wife. And so, Irawati said, yeah, I mean, I said it's a widespread. And she said, it's not just an accepted thing, but it's almost expected. So she doesn't stop here. So this is her, and she goes on to talk about the practice of wife beating in her own family. And that was a little, that's the part where these essays really were important to me, where I get to experience and see what she feels and what her life was about. So she talks about how her father explained to her mother that, listen, I don't take you to see movies and go for walks with you in the evening, but I love you more than these other people that you're talking about do, because I've never raised my hand to you. And she, in not saying what she was saying, she also implies that her brothers did do that. And she never sort of held back from saying the things that she wanted to say, and she just said those things. So those essays gave me insights into her. They were kind of the cement in the bricks of this house, I guess. This house, the analogy is not working here, but and I think that's how that worked for me, where I just got as much as I could, as much information as I could, as much just absorbed everything that I could about the places she had been, the history of the places she had been, not just Berlin, but London, Pune of the time, all of her work, everything that's been written about her, which is really not much at all. And then a friend of mine, Usha Rao in Bangalore, recently called this informed imagination, which I like that worked for me, what she was saying. And this is how that was how and we were writing all along, but this is how the process worked for me. And I can talk about this now because the book is behind us, but we hadn't laid out we'll do it this way or that way. It just kind of evolved like this. And I think part of it is that filling in of everything, of trying to get all the archives and then filling in all the gaps with her own essays and things that I knew that my mother told me about her, and a little bit of what I knew of her. But what I knew of her was the way I knew her was as a child knows an adult. I didn't know her, so that was not something that I could use very much in this, because this is not about me, it was about her. So this book, a biography of a very close ancestor, my grandmother, was sometimes difficult for me because of what Thiago calls the contradictions of her work and her character. And we had to be very clear from the outset, not to obfuscate, not to pretend that she was not full of contradictions. And I think one of the things that surprised me about during this process was, I wasn't surprised, but I was kind of relieved to find that she herself was aware of these contradictions. So in her essay, uh, uh, um, All That Is You, it's a Marathi essay also. She questions herself and she talks about all this, and she kind of shows that that we all, including her, contain multitudes, and that was kind of a relief to me, kind of because you don't want to think of your grandmother as some of those negative things that are of course there about her. Like we can't not we see those in her work, and I'm sure Thiago will talk about that more than I will. For me, I'm just going to stay with my process. One of the things I did try to do in this biography was to understand and explain her way of practicing. Okay, I was going to say Hinduism, but that has different connotations today, so I'm not going to use that term. I'm just going to say to explain her way of practicing religion, I suppose, and um, and her because of her and Yugantha and her devotion to the Mahabharata, and also her rather peculiar devotion to the god Vithoba, which you mentioned, Rukmini, in your. So this was an aspect of her that was odd to me because we are all like the rest of the entire family, we are all atheists, including me, including her husband Dinu, including all her children. And she was the only one who was, off doing these massive pilgrimages and going to Vithoba, not just once, but several times she would go off. And so this was something I wanted to know about and explain in a way, or at least understand. And in this, I also used this opportunity to speak about Hinduism in the biography to talk about the co-opting of it. And then when we were in India, we noticed that actually Irawati Karve herself is being co-opted in certain ways. And we felt that it was incumbent on us to point out that she didn't see, things in quite this way. So, for example, I didn't ever see her wearing a kunku on her head. And if you see pictures of her, like in Pune, there's this, we saw this giant bridge with this big mural of Irawati Karve with a big thing on her. So, of course, she was there. There are photos and records of her, wearing a kunku. It's not that she never did, but in her general life, she didn't, wear those things, those signs of whatever. But that's the picture that's been amplified. So we wanted to kind of talk about that. And so in this process, this is the other thing that I found that was a big relief to me. So to end, I'm just going to read a couple of lines from her essay that you mentioned, Vatsal, which is On the Road, and tell you what this meant to me. So she's met during this walk, which is a pilgrimage from Pune to Pandharpur. She's by this time met a lot of the pilgrims and talked to them and spent a lot of time with them. And then she says about who is this God? She says, it is all a play of the human mind. First, it creates a God with qualities out of a completely indifferent, formless, and attributeless principle, and then makes him the author of everything that happens, and makes him the Lord of the universe, and says, then we can only have what he does not take. So to me, this was a relief, and the way I interpreted it was, okay, so she doesn't see God or Vithoba as something apart from us that exists outside of us, but something that we create in order to, blame and lay our joys and sorrows at the feet of. And so to me, I won't say that she was an atheist, but I would say, that she explains her Vithoba in this way.
Thank you so much, Urmilla, for that very intimate engagement with not just the process of writing, but also through the process of writing, the intimacy with Irawati Karve. And in some ways with, as you are saying, contradictions, and yet compassions of this really great social anthropologist. I'll actually be with whatever troubled metaphor that you had, cement in the bricks of this house. Actually think about a life writing as a house is, I don't think, is something that I have ever thought about. And but that was very, very poignant as to, how is that being built by visiting places, by understanding histories not just through written archives, but through creating a process of archiving. And I think that is something which any kind of biographical work actually gives us. It's this between this space between the archive and the memory is something which is so important. We'll move to Thiago Pinto Barbosa now, who is the other author of the book. And I was actually very intrigued, by reading the conversation that both of you had in what is published, The Contradictions of Irawati Karve, a conversation in the Migrant Knowledge, November 2021. And very clearly, Thiago has been engaging with both Irawati Karve as well as Maharashtra as a site, together with, of course, Berlin. Since about 2018, 2019 is when works get published. So I'm sure things have happened much before that. It would be wonderful, Thiago, for you to take us through the process of piecing this together, piecing a life together, or building a home.
Yeah, I also love this metaphor of building a home together and having, affect and feelings as the cement, because I think that's really what connected the different stories in this biography, and that for us was a really important aspect of writing a biography that is not a conventional biography, right? I think it's a biography where we were very clear that this affective dimension would be very important. So maybe as a bit of a background, first of all, thank you for having this wonderful conversation. It's really nice to see the resonance of the book and to be able to talk about it, because as academics, we're not so used to having people reading our work. So when this happens, I think that's a real blessing, and it's really nice to be able to talk and reflect together about the works that we do. So before I accepted Urmilla's invitation to write the biography, I did my PhD thesis also on Irawati Karve, and my first encounter with her was also rather accidental or coincidental. So I live in Berlin, right? And I was doing my master's in Berlin at the Free University of Berlin. And I was studying in the very same building that Irawati studied for her PhD in the 1920s. Of course, now that building is part of the university, and it's a political science institute where I studied in my MA. But during Carve's time, that building was a place called Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics. So eugenics is the kind of, for those who don't know, is the kind of application of scientific racism for the sake of annihilating certain groups while um, cultivating a specific social group, right? The kind of policy that became so important in Nazi Germany, which also led to genocide, right? And because I was studying in that building, and for me back then, as someone who also came from Brazil, and for me it was quite shocking to see that my German colleagues didn't know about the history of that building. So I decided with a group of colleagues, back then we were students, to make an exhibition about that history of that institute for basically race and eugenics research, right? And I was very surprised to find out that there were many international students in that time, so 1920s, 1930s, studying in that German tradition of racial anthropology. And there were a few students from India, one of them being P.C. Biswas, who then later became the first director of the Delhi University Anthropology Department, and the other was Irawati. And what was so interesting about her was so I read all the papers that researchers in that institute wrote, all the papers and articles and works that they ever wrote. And Carve's PhD thesis stood out as the only piece of research in that time and place that contradicted racist theory of that time. And I thought this was quite interesting. And I wonder, okay, who was this person and how come did it take Indian woman to be the only one in this international research center to contradict a racist theory? So her research, she researched on the when she was in Berlin, she was given the task by her German supervisor, Eugen Fischer, to test the hypothesis of whether um, the right side of the skull in white Europeans would be bigger compared to other so-called races, right? So, and this hypothesis comes from this racist idea that white Europeans would be more civilized and more rational. Therefore, they would have a bigger size, a bigger side, a bigger right brain side, and therefore they would have more skull asymmetry. So Carve analyzed over almost 200 skulls from different places, from different continents, and her conclusion was, well, there is no such thing as a correlation between what's called races and this skull asymmetry. So she contradicted the hypothesis and she got the lowest grade possible just to pass by her German supervisor, but then she did pass. And then she went on to, well, travel back to India, where she then later became, well, the first appointed woman to be a professor for anthropology and sociology at the Deccan College in Pune. And I was fascinated by that. And so that was my starting point into my PhD research. So I went to India to also think about, so my initial question there was to think about really the long-standing impact of that tradition of thinking, that kind of very racist and racial scholarship that, of course, became very big in Germany. And also, shaped the political context, but it was also reinforced by the Nazi political context, right? And I wanted to really address the transnational impact of that kind of scientific racism that came from Germany, and also, thinking through Carve. And of course, Carve's work is much more, is very vast, and she did not do only physical or biological anthropology. I think and that was fascinating too to find out, right? Her whole work in the field of culture, feminism, or feminist scholarship, and her work in social anthropology. But I did focus my PhD more on this physical anthropological aspect because I wanted to find out how her thinking has changed and how she also applied those methods that she learned in Germany to then research on variation of caste groups in Maharashtra, for instance, or in the whole of India. And that's the contradiction Umi was also talking about. And of course, that contradiction is easier to see from today's perspective, right? Because I think from the historical distance, today we know that those kinds of measurement methods that essentialize the body to explain diversity, that measure the body and translate the body variation in numbers to then say, how castes are different or related. We see today that that kind of methodology has a racial background, and I think science across the 20th century has moved away from a biological concept of race, right? We understand now the risks of the essentialization that concept brings about, right? But of course, this was a debate in the 20th century, and at the same time that Carve was critical of the more racist, pronounced racist aspects of that scholarship, she was also using those methods, and I think that that's a contradiction that I think is very interesting to look at from today's perspective, just so we understand also, the that kind of legacy in thinking in science, right? And I think this raises many questions about the impact of Eurocentric sciences, right? It raises many questions about how can we, as scientists from the global south, also move away from that sort of Eurocentric bias in science. At the same time, that we want to be part of an international community of scholars, right? So there are questions there of being part of a scientific community and also wanting to be craving knowledge or creating knowledge that is that suits a different context. So all these questions, I think, they're very fascinating. That's something I try to work through also in the thesis, but also in this biography. So coming to the biography, what happened is that I was writing this thesis, and my supervisor was like, "Well, you have so much biographical data, and you're doing a thesis in anthropology. Maybe you should, cut that out and try to fit somewhere else." And I thought, oh, well, that's a pity, but I understood her, and she was right because my PhD thesis was more about, science really, and about scientific research today and the legacy of scientific racism today, much more than just about Carve. Um, but then when Umi asked me to let's write this together, this biography, I said, okay, sure, let's do it. And it was very fun to work with her because I'm more used to a more academic style of writing, more structured way of thinking and writing. And I think writing with Umi was a lot of fun because she would, encourage me to just follow intuition and feelings and even though we everything we wrote was also based by facts and informed by facts, we in a biography like that we had more room to create a scenery and more room to talk about things that you wouldn't talk in an academic book, right? So this process was really fun, and we tried to keep that question alive in the biography as well of that contradiction, and we try to keep all the nuances alive in the biography. And that's why the biography also starts, it's not a chronological biography, it's not that kind of boring biography that starts with the day she was born and then goes until her death. But we did start with her time in Berlin in the 1920s, which is a very exciting time, I think, in history and in that place. The 1920s in Berlin is a time where there was a lot in the air, right? This was before the ascension of the emergence of National Socialism. It was a time when science was very progressive in terms of gender issues, right? In terms of sexuality. And Berlin was a very special place for that as well. There was a lot of queerness in the city. There was a lot of research about that. There were many international students in Berlin. Many of them were financed by the German government because the German government also wanted to finance or give scholarships to anti-colonial students from Asia as a way to sort of that was the German government strategy to do something against the UK. So many students from South Asia would gather in Berlin and also conspire against empire. And so that was a very interesting time. So that's why we wanted to start with Carve in Berlin to then also think about what does that connection mean, right? And I think that connection that she had with those scientists and professors who later became so involved in Nazi politics, right? Became so entangled in the eugenesis project of Nazism. And I think that had also a big impact in her career. and maybe that's something we can open up in the discussion. But I mean, the book makes that travel from Berlin, and they started in Berlin, but then goes then into her life, and then finishes again with her reflection about her connection to her Nazi professor. And she said in a letter that she wrote that was collected by another German colleague, so to celebrate the birthday of Eugen Fischer, her professor. So that German colleague was collecting birthday greetings from different students. And Carve wrote in a letter that because of Eugen Fischer, she learned the most difficult lesson in Hindu philosophy. She didn't explain in that letter what that lesson was, but I think that's something Umi and I found out in our research, because I think that reflects also her uh, essay, All That Is You, where she has a very deep, sorrowful confrontation with the fact that she was trained in that place in Germany, and she was so shocked to read the reports about the trial of the Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann. This was an officer who was responsible for the killing of thousands of people himself. He was the sole responsible of taking those decisions. And the defense his defense in the trial argued that he was just following orders and that he was just an ordinary man. And that put her in a deep state of confrontation with that Hindu philosophical idea of we are all that around us is also us, right? And that she was thinking about that right before she read the report, and then she got to think about, okay, am I also Eichmann? Am I also part of this? And she has that confrontation with the fact that we're all part of a society that where there are people doing all sorts of things and horrible things that are also part of the context that we are inserted, and somehow we carry some shared responsibility to the world around us to some extent. And I think that's something she reflected a lot about in the end of her life. Also because her professor Eugen Fischer, and that's something she tells in that letter to the German colleague. He was also capable of showing affection. He had a moment, or she had a moment where she was very sad in Berlin, looking outside the window in a horrible gray cold day in Berlin winter, and she was crying, and he came to her in a very surprising way and told her, "Don't be sad, don't cry. The leaves are coming back soon." So she thinks, how can a man like that also be, how unexpected that he would share those words of affection. And I think that made her think also about how complicated human beings can be, and how the evil is also part of humanity as any other trait, and that we have to try to cope with that. And yeah, so this took a dark turn, but we can open that up or not in the Q&A, I guess.
Rather than a dark turn, maybe a really philosophical turn, Thiago. And the place where you end it is asking me literally to quote from your book, page 233, which is at the conclusion of her essay, All That Is You. Irawati describes experiencing a sense of spiritual devastation as she looked back at her life, her career, and all the troubles in Germany, India, and the world. Yes, yes, my little granddaughter is I, the dog with his wagging tail looking at me with his expressive eyes is I. The cuckoo flying through the limitless blue sky is I. The magnificent evening is I. Eichmann, Stalin, Hitler, murderers, them who burn down houses, rioters, them who escape from burning houses, those who die in pits is I. All of it is I. I am all of it. My confession is done, and at the moment of knowing, I am ashes. This uh, this coming together of the affect, the contradiction, the reflexivity, it warrants us to really think what kind of legacy do we want to think that Irawati Karve has left us with at a juncture today when, again, very, very poignantly, you begin the book with a quote from Karve's The Racial Factor in Indian Social Life, 1963, where she says, all those who are in India today who feel it is their homeland are Indians. I think with that, I would just like to maybe end by, before opening it up for discussion with Rituparna and Dipali, is, for students of sociology and anthropology, some of these works remain at the margins. They do not become part of, let's say, even research methods curriculum. And I was deeply intrigued by something that you said, Thiago, that anthropology took you to biography. As if in some ways, the kind of research that you were doing in anthropology, you've developed so much of the biographical there that one reaches the biography. You write, both of you write in one of your chapters about the literary turn in anthropology. And how is it that we actually engage with works like this, a biographical work, which is bringing together the self and the other, the memory and history, the public and the private, the social and the political, the affect, the emotion, and the anthropological in such deep ways. One can only hope that this would be part of reading texts, of doing anthropological work, doing sociological work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'd like to go ahead first. And you left a very important point, and you made a very important point, Professor Sen, that, how to engage, like how do we as sociologists or anthropologists engage with works like this? And perhaps this, and I mean, I'd like to say that listening to both the authors has been extremely interesting. But, my question is to both of you, but most particularly to Thiago, because you've worked a lot with archives, right? And a lot of our viewers on Doing Sociology are also very young researchers or students who are trying to maybe begin their research. So could you share a little bit about what working with archives was like, and maybe the challenges, because your work also you are looking back at the discipline of anthropology. It's like turning the gaze the other way around to universities and spaces like that. So if you could talk a little bit about your research and maybe some of the challenges.
Yeah, sure. Thank you both for these wonderful questions and interpellations. Starting with the last one, I think, I was not trained as a historian, but when I wanted to then do this, work where through a through anthropological perspective, I will look into the history of anthropology again. Then I was in conversation with a lot of colleagues from history, right? And as an anthropologist, I take for granted that every archive, or indeed every source, is not enough, right? Every archive will have gaps. Every source will have gaps. So I think I did visit all the archives that I could that were in relation to Carve. For instance, the archive of that institute here in Berlin, an archive that is actually quite small because most of the documents were destroyed at the end of the war intentionally. Um, but then, I pieced many different sources and archives together. Umi also found many interesting letters in the archives of the Rockefeller Foundation in the US because Carve got a scholarship from them. She was traveling there in the US with with that foundation. Um, and then I think oral history was also an important part of this historical approach, right? So I was talking to everybody who knew Carve, the family members, the students. Um, I was visiting her institutions and also looking at those libraries, right? For instance, the library at Deakin College, they have Carve's private books. They're there. And that tells a lot about a person, right? A shelf, someone's shelf is a big archive. And in fact, there were different books there that also show that she was following debates about German anthropology. And that was interesting for me too, to see. Sometimes even with a dedication by someone, I could track, okay, she met that person and they talked about this book at some point, right? So um, you see, it's a bit of like a little ant work, right? A little ant going through our different archives and trying to see what we can find. But I think that this openness to not take the archive for granted, because there is not one official archive. There are different ways of complementing the archive or doing an unarchive, anarchist archival work, sort of. There are different strategies there, and I think that's really important, especially when you're doing a history of science in the global south. We don't have that many archives in that sense, right? Even that's a reality, not just in India, but also in Brazil, where I come from. So we have to go for other sources and really talking to people. I mean, Carmen didn't die that long ago, but so that she left a lot of people who are now still alive. So those impressions were really important too, right? To construct the a picture of this person, right? So the biography is just an attempt to put different pieces together and show a person from different sides, right? And I think this the question of what kind of legacy, if we should address that now, unless Dipali has another question, but that kind of legacy that she leaves us with, I think that's such a very profound question, right? And I think well, there are two things that I maybe wanted to highlight, or maybe three, maybe two. But I think the conversation about the role of gender in science, that's a conversation that we're still having, right? About the role of women and other marginalized people in science. That's a conversation we're still having that I think it's really worth pushing forward. And I think, well, Carve would be tired of talking about this now, but some conversations take time. Things don't go forward as fast as we want them to go, so we have to keep that that conversation alive. And I think we showed through the book that it was not easy for a woman of that time to do the kind of work that she was doing, as you said, Professor, that she was taking public transport to travel to different places. As a woman back then in the 1930s, even, right? That must have been very challenging. Of course, she had the help of her husband, as Umi likes to remind us, but also the help of her, family. She was from a privileged background, right? One has to say that too, and that also helped her career. But I think discussing, the gender in science, it's still a task that needs to be done. So that's one of the takeaways of the book, and also I think of her legacy. And I think the other thing is one main point is really this question about well, the legacies of scientific racism in anthropology, in other sciences like genetics that also deal with caste and deal with human diversity, right? And I think we've seen in many different contexts that that kind of knowledge can be mobilized in political ways, sometimes to exclude groups of people, right? Or to put certain groups of people down, to hierarchize. And there is a big danger there that I think we need to take into account as we do anthropology, right? So that I think the question here is that entanglement between science and politics. I think that's a big, profound discussion in philosophy of science that I think is also worth having and discussing. And I think we also try to show that Carve's thinking has changed throughout her career because she was so attuned to discussions in the world, right? So I think we did mention that, you know, in the year of the partition, she wrote a text that can be read today as an anti-Muslim text. And then later she would take a U-turn and say, well, no, India is the home for everybody who calls India a home, right? Which still resonates today as something almost radical, unfortunately, right? But it is still quite progressive, that kind of thinking, to think that everybody who thinks a place is their home should be a citizen of that place. And I think that shows us that you know, scientists can also change their thinking, and also should go on with the time to, you know, be responsible, you know, for the effects of the knowledge that they put out there in the world. Maybe I'm gonna pass it on to Umi now. But maybe one last thing. I think one thing that I also wanted to cherish in this biography is this love for life and this anthropological curiosity about the world, this anthropological vision of appreciating humankind in its many different forms. And I think that's very dear to anthropology, and that was very dear to Carve herself as a person. And I think that's something that we try to cultivate in the book.
Right.
So,
I
Umi, if
do
you want
have,
to, sorry.
sorry, do you want to continue?
I just wanted to say one last thing that I was going to say as part of my conversation, but at the end of all this, Thiago and I were in India in February, and we met various people, and we had events for the book and so on. And then we were at this one lunch with my uncle, who is Irawati's son, and several other family members. And I looked at him. He's close to 90 now. So I looked at him and I said, I knew he'd read the book, and I said, Nandu Mama, do you think we portrayed your mother? Do you think that that was your mother? Do you think we did that well? And there was such a long silence that both Thiago and I got a little bit worried. And then he looked at me and he said, yes. And that was really important to us because, you know, her student Casey Malhotra, her own son, if they find that we have that is Irawati, we were very satisfied with the answer. We were very, you know, in that moment, both of us just were like, I think relieved also, but it meant a lot to us that he said yes, because here was someone who knew her. I mean, we did not. You know, Thiago, of course, has never met her, and I only, like I said, knew her as a child. So I think we managed something there.
And yet we establish connections so much with the unknown, sometimes more than the known.
Yeah.
That was such a lovely yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any questions, so maybe we could wind up if it's okay with all of you. Thank you so much, Urmilla, Thiago, and Professor Sen for giving us this time and opportunity. I hope that the video reaches out to newer, audiences, and they take an interest in the book and the works of Irawati Karve. So I also hope that biography as a methodological tool becomes more useful and used in sociology. So thank you once again for this very engaging conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you, Dipali and Rituparna. And it was lovely interacting with Thiago and Urmilla.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. This is lovely. Thank you.
Let us know when you come to India.